The first light of dawn crept over Loch Dhu, casting a silvery sheen across the tranquil waters. Hamish Macbeth, still in his woolen jacket and tartan scarf, was enjoying the rare quiet of a Saturday morning when Constable Blair's hurried knock shattered the calm. "Hamish! You need to see this," Blair panted, a note of urgency in his voice. Curiosity piqued. Hamish followed him down the narrow, winding streets toward the edge of the village, where the stone cottages seemed to huddle together against the chill. They arrived at the home of Alistair Carmichael, a reclusive antiques dealer whose habits were as meticulous as his collection. The door, curiously, was unlocked. Hamish's brow furrowed. Alistair was not the type to leave his door unlatched. Inside, the scene was perplexing. The living room, usually cluttered with curious objects from far-flung corners of the world, was pristine, almost sterile. A fine layer of dust settled over the Persian carpets, yet the centre of the room held a single disturbing anomaly: Alistair's body. He was sprawled unnaturally across the floor, a neat, almost deliberate line of blood seeping into the rug beneath him. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, and curiously, nothing had been taken. What drew Hamish's attention most was the object beside the body. It was an antique pocket watch, open to reveal its face, and resting upon it was a small folded piece of paper with a single word written in smudged ink: "Home." It was absurdly simple, yet hauntingly cryptic. Hamish knelt, turning the paper over in his gloved hands, trying to glean some meaning. There were no fingerprints, no indication who had left it. For a man who collected rare manuscripts and historical oddities, Alistair had never been the sort to leave notes in such a sloppy manner. Hamish's gaze swept the room, lingering on the window which opened onto a narrow alleyway. No footprints led away from it in the morning frost, and the lock was intact from the inside. Whoever had come, or gone, had done so without leaving a trace. He rose, pacing slowly, mind working through the possibilities. A locked room mystery, indeed. But this was no ordinary puzzle. There was something theatrical about the arrangement, as if the killer wanted to confuse, to mislead. The precision of the body's position, the deliberate placement of the watch and note, the absence of any apparent motive, all of it suggested a plan far more intricate than a simple robbery or crime of passion. Blair shuffled nervously, casting glances around the room. Could it be someone he knew? Family, friends, rivals? He ventured. Hamish shook his head slowly. That would be too obvious, Blair. No one visits Alistair without calling first. He was careful, meticulous. This isn't a crime of opportunity. Whoever did this wanted to send a message, or to frame it as something unsolvable. Hamish's eyes then settled on the fireplace mantel. A row of delicate porcelain figurines lined the edge, all intact. But one, a small fox with a chipped ear, had been turned to face the room differently than the rest. Tiny details, almost invisible to the casual observer, seemed to hum with significance. Hamish bent closer, noting a faint smear of blood on the figurine's paw. He frowned. It's a sign, Blair, not random. Whoever did this left a breadcrumb, but why leave it at all if they intended to disappear without a trace? He moved to the study, where books were stacked in perfect order, and found a journal open on the desk. The last entry was mundane, noting a recent acquisition of a rare silver snuff-box, but in the margin, in shaky handwriting, was another single word: return. Hamish felt a chill run down his spine. Home. Return. The notes are connected, I'm certain of it. But to what? Stepping back into the living room, Hamish surveyed the scene again. Outside, the village began to stir, unaware of the dark puzzle within the quiet stone walls. The crime, seemingly impossible, left no immediate suspects, no clear motive, and yet it screamed of intent. Whoever had done this had orchestrated every detail, leaving a trail of contradictions, signs of a struggle but none, a note but no clue to its author, a room locked from the inside, yet open to deception. Hamish stood in the centre of the room, the weight of the mystery settling around him like the morning mist over the loch. The puzzle was insoluble to anyone lacking patience and insight, but Hamish, as always, had a knack for seeing what others overlooked. The first rule of a locked-room mystery, he reminded himself, was that nothing is truly impossible. The question, he murmured, almost to himself, was simple. Who killed the man who had returned home? And more importantly, why? The answer would not come easily, but already, in the quiet precision of the scene, Hamish felt the threads of the mystery beginning to tug at him. Every object, every subtle displacement, every cryptic word was a piece of the puzzle. Somewhere among them lay the truth, hidden yet deliberate, waiting for him to unravel. And Hamish, with his steady patience and intuitive insight, knew he would follow it, no matter how tangled or treacherous the path. Hamish returned to the scene later that morning, after having taken a brief walk along the loch to clear his mind. The sunlight now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like tiny, lazy spectres. Constable Blair had begun the official sweep, methodically photographing the room, measuring distances and jotting down notes with a diligence that would have satisfied any procedural manual. Yet Hamish's attention was drawn to the finer, quieter details that Blair, with his eager but conventional approach, overlooked. He crouched beside the Persian rug, tracing the delicate, almost imperceptible scuff marks near the doorway. They suggested that someone had entered or left with care, balancing their steps deliberately to avoid disturbing the patterned weave. It wasn't merely the absence of footprints outside the window, it was the intentional choreography of movement within the room itself. A casual observer might have dismissed the marks as ordinary wear, but Hamish noted their subtle pattern. Someone had rehearsed their movements, or had the benefit of experience in avoiding evidence. Then his gaze drifted to the fireplace again. The small fox figurine, turned slightly to face the room, seemed almost insignificant at first glance, yet the smear of blood on its paw caught the light differently than the dried drops on the carpet. It was faint, almost invisible, and placed with deliberate care. Hamish picked up the figurine and inspected it closely. There was something engraved on the base, nearly worn away, a series of tiny initials barely discernible under the grime. A message hidden in plain sight, he murmured. Blair, hovering nervously nearby, cleared his throat. "Do you think someone left this deliberately?" he asked. Hamish didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the desk where Alistair's journal still lay open. The E-word return on the margin seemed like a clue that had been meant for someone, or perhaps a warning. But the handwriting was hesitant, shaky in spots, as though penned under stress. Hamish turned the pages carefully, noting that the entries alternated between meticulous descriptions of acquisitions and increasingly anxious fragmented notes about meetings with unnamed visitors. There was a pattern, yet its meaning remained just beyond reach. Hamish's attention then shifted to a small bookshelf tucked into a corner, one that Blair had assumed held nothing more than dust-covered tomes. A single book, larger and heavier than the others, was slightly out of alignment. Pulling it free, Hamish discovered a folded envelope wedged behind it. The paper was aged and brittle, and inside was a single photograph, Alistair, standing in front of a modest cottage, arms crossed, expression tense. On the back, in the same shaky script as the journal, were the words, "He knows. Protect him." Hamish's brow furrowed. The photograph was recent, yet its message was cryptic. Who was he? Who required protection? And from whom? The layers of secrecy were stacking fast, each more confounding than the last. He felt a flicker of excitement. This was no ordinary case of petty theft or personal vendetta. Someone had orchestrated a drama, leaving behind breadcrumbs meant to tease, mislead, or intimidate. A sudden noise outside made Hamish glance up. Mrs. Mackenzie, a neighbour known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, was peering through the window. Her reaction caught Hamish immediately. She gasped, and then, as if realizing she had been seen, stiffened, pulling back from the glass with an air of overdone casualness. That subtle hesitation, a pause too long, a glance too quick, spoke volumes to him. She knew something, and she was trying not to let it show. Hamish noted the details carefully, her wrinkled hands gripping the sill, the tension in her shoulders, and the way her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the back alley. It was the first genuine sign of deception he had observed. Not outright lies, but the instinctive micro-reactions that betrayed hidden knowledge. Most people would see a neighbour merely startled by a tragic scene. Hamish saw a hint of guilt, or at least complicity. Returning to the body, he examined the wristwatch once more. The hands were frozen at a precise time, 6:17. Why that time? A glance at Alistair's journal revealed that he often noted appointments down to the minute. Had this been a meeting that went horribly wrong, or a signal to someone else? The possibilities spun around in Hamish's mind like autumn leaves caught in the wind, each one plausible yet incomplete. By mid-morning, the official investigation had begun to feel routine, almost mechanical. Officers were checking the obvious avenues, asking questions that led to dead ends. Hamish, meanwhile, continued to piece together subtle inconsistencies: the misaligned book, the engraved initials, Mr. Miss Mackenzie's furtive glance, the photograph's warning, and the carefully staged scene. Each element alone could be coincidence, but together they formed a pattern that demanded attention. Standing in the centre of the room, Hamish allowed himself a quiet smile. The threads of the mystery were beginning to reveal themselves, though the full tapestry remained hidden. Someone had left traces, small and deliberate, for a keen observer to follow, and Hamish, with his patient eye for the unnoticed and his instinct for human behaviour, knew he had begun to unravel the first layer of what would be a far deeper, far more twisted tale than Lochdoe had seen in years. The puzzle was no longer merely a question of who had killed Alistair Carmichael. It was becoming a story of secrets, lies, and carefully hidden truths waiting to be drawn out into the cold morning light. Hamish left the Carmichael residence with a quiet sense of urgency. The morning had revealed only the surface of the puzzle, and he knew that the next step would involve the people of Lochdoe, whose lives were entwined with Alistair's in ways far subtler than the obvious. He started with Mrs. Mackenzie, still lingering near her doorway as if waiting for someone to confront her. Hamish approached her gently, giving the impression of a casual chat rather than an interrogation. "Good morning, Mrs. Mackenzie. Did you see anything unusual yesterday evening?" Her eyes flickered nervously, and she fumbled with the clasp of her handbag. "Oh, I don't rightly know. I was indoors mostly. Heard noises perhaps, but nothing clear," she stammered. Yet her hands betrayed her. They twitched as though she wanted to hide something, a small movement Hamish noted with the patience of a hawk. "Noises?" he pressed, tilting his head. "Could you be more specific?" She hesitated, then said, almost too quickly, "Just a thump, maybe a door. That's all, really." Too quick, Hamish thought, and yet precise enough to suggest she was carefully controlling her story. Next he visited Angus Ritchie, a local fisherman who supplied Alistair with herbs and occasionally antiquities. Ritchie was eager, almost jovial, recounting his evening in excruciating detail. "I was at the pier, fixing my nets. Saw nothing untoward. Alistair's house? Well, it's a quiet place, and I'd not disturb it." He smiled too broadly, hands gesturing wildly as if to overwhelm the listener with confidence. Hamish listened carefully, noting that Ritchie's story, though seemingly straightforward, contained inconsistencies in timing. He claimed to have been at the pier until almost 9, yet another villager had reported seeing him in the main street around 8:45. Was it forgetfulness or deliberate misdirection? Even the village shopkeeper, Ailid MacDonald, offered details that didn't quite align. Alistair came in for his papers, yes, around 5, I'd say. He seemed distracted, not like himself, really. Said he had a visitor coming, boo. T didn't say who. Her tone was careful, measured, and her eyes avoided Hamish's, as though she were weighing each word. He caught a subtle twitch of her lips when he asked about anyone else in the village acting strangely. A lie of omission, perhaps, or a hesitation born of fear. As he moved through the village, Hamish began to see a pattern emerging in the fabric of deception. Some, like Mrs. Mackenzie, were trying to hide something small, perhaps innocuous, or perhaps vital. Others, like Ritchie, appeared over-eager, their exaggerated narratives a shield against scrutiny. Ailid's caution suggested she was protecting information, but from whom? Each version of events was partial, distorted, or selectively remembered, and yet together they formed a web Hamish could almost see taking shape. Returning to the Carmichael house, he examined the alleyway again, noting the faint traces of scuff marks in the soil, easily overlooked. A careful step here, a dragged heel there, and the faint evidence suggested someone had met Alistair outside the house. Perhaps the visitor had been invited, or forced, but the marks indicated a deliberate attempt to stage the scene as a closed-room mystery. Hamish's mind ticked over the possibilities. Who had the knowledge and presence of mind to manipulate both a body and the village's perceptions? He called Blair over, whispering observations that the constable might not have considered significant. Notice the difference in stories, Blair. Some are too eager, some too hesitant. There's fear, pride, and perhaps guilt, all wrapped into their words. The truth is hidden in those small contradictions, if only we can untangle them. By late afternoon, Hamish had gathered enough to begin seeing fissures in the seemingly straightforward village life. Mrs. Mackenzie's fear, Richie's over-enthusiasm, and Ailid's cautious precision hinted at motives that were anything but simple. The puzzle was no longer solely about a locked room or a cryptic note. It was about human nature itself. The small lies, the deliberate omissions, the subtle manipulations. Each villager carried a fragment of truth and a shadow of deception, and it was Hamish's task to separate them. The sun dipped toward the western hills, casting long shadows over the loch. Hamish felt the pulse of the investigation quicken. The voices of Loch Dhu had begun to speak in code, truth tangled with lies, each revealing and concealing at once. Somewhere in the careful threading of stories lay the identity of the person who had orchestrated Alistair Carmichael's final hours, and Hamish, with patience honed by years of seeing what others overlooked, knew that the day's revelations were only the beginning. The true deception had yet to reveal itself, and when it did, it would demand every ounce of his attention and cunning to untangle. Hamish spent the evening in quiet contemplation, seated by the flickering hearth of his small police office. The village of Loch Dhu had gone to be Ed under the soft cloak of darkness, but the mystery weighed heavily on him. The faces and voices of the day's witnesses, the hesitant glance of Mrs. Mackenzie, the overly confident swagger of Angus Ritchie, and the measured caution of Ailid MacDonald swirled through his mind like pieces of a puzzle whose image remained just beyond clarity. It was time to look at motives, the hidden engines behind the actions of men and women who, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Lister Carmichael had been a man of some wealth, his collection of antiques and rare manuscripts the envy of a few and the curiosity of many. Greed, Hamish thought, was the simplest motive. Anyone who had known of the silver snuff-box he had recently acquired, or the antique watch with the mysterious engraving, could have seen an opportunity. But would greed alone explain the meticulous staging, the cryptic notes, and the subtle misdirection? It seemed too theatrical for mere theft. Then there was envy, subtler and more corrosive. Hamish thought of Angus Ritchie, whose cheerful tales of fishing and errands masked a thinly veiled resentment. Ritchie had long felt overshadowed by Alistair's reputation for refinement, and though he seemed eager to cooperate, his repeated exaggerations and small contradictions hinted at a desire to impress or distract. A man like that could be pushed to extremes, especially if he felt humiliated or slighted. Jealousy, too, came into play. Ailid MacDonald, the shopkeeper, had interacted frequently with Alistair, often handling his transactions personally. Her careful avoidance of certain questions suggested more than caution. There was history there, perhaps unspoken rivalry, or the quiet sting of spurned trust. If Alistair had slighted someone close to her, or if she had harboured ambitions thwarted by his meticulous nature, anger could have brewed silently until it became lethal. Fear, the most insidious motive, was layered throughout the village. Mrs. Mackenzie's furtive reactions suggested knowledge she did not wish to reveal. Had she witnessed something she shouldn't have, or had she been threatened herself? Her carefully measured words and hesitant glances indicated a mind tightly controlled by anxiety, the type that made a person susceptible to coercion, or to making a desperate decision under pressure. Hamish began to chart the connections, sketching them roughly on a scrap of paper. Alistair at the centre, with lines stretching to Ritchie, Aylid, Mrs. Mackenzie, and others whose roles were more peripheral. Each line represented a mixture of personal history, opportunity, and motive, tangled into a web that resisted simple explanations. The silver snuff-box acquisition had coincided with an unexpected visitor, one who had never been named, and Alistair's last journal entries hinted at unease, a sense that someone knew more than they should. Alibis were equally convoluted. Ritchie's claim of being at the pier conflicted with sightings in the village, though. He insisted it was a matter of timing misremembered. Mrs. Mackenzie's account was evasive. She couldn't place herself solidly at any one location during the evening, only that she had remained mostly indoors. Aylid, by contrast, provided precise details, yet her meticulous accounting raised as many questions as it answered. The truth, Hamish realised, lay not in what they said, but in what they tried to conceal. Hamish reviewed the small anomalies he had noted earlier. The engraved initials on the fox figurine, the photograph with its cryptic warning, the folded note beside the antique watch, and the frozen time on the watch itself. Each detail, while minor alone, connected to the motives he was now sorting. Greed could explain the artifacts, envy and jealousy the personal resentments, and fear the urgent desire to manipulate appearances. Together, they painted a complex landscape where every suspect could, in theory, have acted with intent, but none provided a complete answer. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. The motive maze was tangled, every path twisting into another. No single theory explained all elements of the crime, yet the threads he had uncovered formed a network that could not be ignored. Each suspect's story intersected with the others in subtle, sometimes contradictory ways, and each action, however small, had been deliberate. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. The challenge was no longer merely to find who had killed Alistair Carmichael, it was to untangle the web of desire, fear, and secrecy that had led to his death. Night deepened over Loch Dhu, the village silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the soft lap of water against the loch's edge. Hamish's mind, sharp and alert, circled the possibilities. The maze of motives would not yield easily, but it was not unsolvable. Somewhere within the twisting corridors of greed, jealousy, envy, and fear lay the spark that had ignited this tragic event. And Hamish, patient and observant, would follow it wherever it led, peeling back the layers until the truth, hidden, deliberate, and human, stood revealed in the cold morning light. The following morning, Hamish returned to the Carmichael residence. Though the air of finality that had settled over Loch Dhu was palpable, word had spread through the village that the police believed they had found a breakthrough. Blair, along with a visiting inspector from Inverness, seemed eager to announce a solution, though Hamish approached with measured scepticism. The breakthrough, according to the official report, was a fingerprint on the antique watch. It matched Angus Ritchie's, and combined with his inconsistent alibi and admitted visits to Alistair's home the previous evening, the authorities felt confident they had their culprit. They were ready to present the arrest as a tidy resolution to a case that had confounded them for days. "It fits, doesn't it, Hamish?" Blair said, eyes bright with relief. "The motive, the opportunity, she did it." Hamish studied the watch, turning it over in his hands with a careful scrutiny that the others seemed to lack. The fingerprint was indeed there, smudged but discernible. Yet he noticed something others had not. The print was not fresh. It had been pressed into the metal hours, perhaps even days earlier, then meticulously polished around it. A stage had been set, but the actor was not necessarily the one who had committed the final act. He called Blair aside, lowering his voice. "Blair, fingerprints alone are seldom proof of guilt, especially on items handled daily." Alistair's possessions were touched by many, and notice the positioning of the watch and note. They're almost theatrical. Someone is trying to convince us it's simple. but the scene is too deliberate, too perfect, too neat to be genuine. Blair frowned, uncertain, but nodded, trusting Hamish's instincts, even if the evidence appeared airtight. Hamish retraced the steps of the previous evening, imagining each suspect's movements, comparing them to the inconsistencies he had noted. The photograph with its cryptic warning, the engraved initials on the fox figurine, Mrs. Mackenzie's subtle fear, Ailid's cautious avoidance, all of these elements hinted at a deeper orchestration. A single, elegant misdirection had led the authorities to seize on Ritchie as the suspect. Yet Hamish felt the pull of a hidden current, one that suggested the real architect of the crime had been content to let others take the bull. Aimé, temporarily. Later that day, Ritchie himself arrived at the station voluntarily, eager to explain. He was defensive, yet strangely composed, insisting that he had visited Alistair in the afternoon to deliver a package and had left long before nightfall. Hamish listened quietly, noting the careful way he recounted times and locations, the pauses that betrayed either rehearsed innocence or a man unconcerned because he knew the authorities had jumped to conclusions. Outside, Mrs. Mackenzie lingered again, watching the comings and goings with an intensity that Hamish could not ignore. When their eyes met, she quickly turned away, but he saw a flicker of something that did not belong to guilt alone, anticipation, perhaps satisfaction at the confusion that had temporarily cloaked the real culprit. By evening, the inspector and Blair were convinced the case was closed. The village buzzed with relief, the story of Ritchie's capture spreading with a sense of finality. Yet Hamish could not shake the feeling of unease that clung to him like mist over the loch. The pieces of the puzzle did not fit neatly into this tidy narrative. They fit better into a story of orchestration, of someone playing on the village's expectations to hide the truth. The true criminal had orchestrated the chaos, leaving behind enough breadcrumbs to mislead the authorities while remaining in the shadows, waiting, patient. Hamish returned to the Carmichael home one last time before dusk, moving quietly through the rooms he knew so well. He inspected the watch again, the fox figurine and the scattered objects on the desk. His eyes lingered on the folded note, still resting atop the timepiece. The ink had dried, the paper creased, and yet it seemed almost to pulse with the intention behind it. Whoever had left it had been clever, deliberate, and most importantly, unafraid. He stepped outside, drawing a deep breath of the chill evening air. The village, lulled into complacency by a false victory, had lowered its guard. But Hamish knew better. The strands of deception were still alive, humming under the surface, and the person who had truly planned Alistair Carmichael's demise remained hidden, watching the results of their clever misdirection unfold. The real story was not yet told, and Hamish could feel the tide turning, drawing him closer to the truth that the others could not yet see. Somewhere in the calm streets of Loch Dhu, the criminal waited, confident that Hamish Macbeth's patience, and only his patience, would be the tool that finally unravelled the carefully constructed illusion. Hamish spent the next morning sifting through the village records and old police reports, searching for anything that might explain the careful orchestration he had observed. The Carmichael case had, in its first layers, seemed like a matter of opportunity and local grudges, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt as though history itself was at work. A crime, he realized, could be petty, stretching its tendrils across years until the right moment arrived. It was an entry in a dusty, nearly forgotten logbook that caught his eye. 10 years ago, another man had disappeared from the village, Fergus MacLean, a collector much like Alistair. The case had gone cold, with no suspects and little evidence beyond a cryptic note left on MacLean's desk. "Return what is owed." Hamish frowned as he flipped through the old statements. Several names repeated: Mrs. Mackenzie, Ailid MacDonald, and, surprisingly, Angus Ritchie. All had been peripheral in the investigation at the time, offering minor observations or errands they had run, yet their presence had been documented. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Returning to the present, Hamish pieced together timelines and relationships. Alistair had recently acquired a rare collection of letters and ledgers, some of which had belonged to the MacLean estate. It suddenly made sense, the return note in his own journal, and the word home on the folded scrap with the pocket watch were not random. They were echoes of a debt, financial, personal, or perhaps moral, that had never been settled. Someone had waited years, and the threads of past grievances had woven themselves tightly around the present. Hamish's mind raced as he reconstructed possible interactions. Mrs. Mackenzie had lived in Loch Dhu long enough to witness the disappearance of Maclean, and her nervous demeanour now took on a new significance. Her fear was not merely of the recent crime, but of an unresolved chapter from her past, one she had perhaps tried to bury along with her guilt or knowledge. Elid's caution, too, now hinted at a deeper involvement. If she had been connected to Maclean or his estate, then Alistair's possession of those ledgers would have been a dangerous revelation. Ven Ritchie, whose fingerprint had been used to stage the apparent breakthrough, now seemed to occupy a more complicated role. Perhaps he was being manipulated, or perhaps he had participated in earlier schemes and had been willing to allow himself to be blamed once again. The pattern of behaviour suggested a history of deception, of debts left unpaid, and of consequences quietly accumulating until the right opportunity presented itself. Hamish revisited the Carmichael house, scrutinising the objects once more. The fox figurine with the faint blood smear, the folded note on the watch, and the photograph in the hidden envelope, all were relics of not just a single night's crime, but a continuum of old grievances. The initials on the figurine, which had seemed insignificant, now hinted at identities from the past, perhaps signatures of those who had orchestrated events both then and now. Piecing together the interactions of the villagers, Hamish realised the crime was not merely opportunistic, it was cyclical. The past had reached into the present, using the weaknesses, ambitions, and fears of the living to exact a form of justice or revenge. The motives, tangled as they were, had been guided by the same hand that had influenced events 10 years prior, the same hand patient enough to wait for Alistair to return possessions or knowledge that had been withheld. Even small details took on new meaning. The time frozen on the watch, the precise placement of objects, and the cryptic wording of the notes were deliberate references to history, coded messages meant to remind the participants of what had come before. The past had been left unread for too long, and now it demanded attention in the most dramatic of ways. By dusk, Hamish sat in quiet reflection, tracing the web that spanned a decade. The village of Loch Dhu, serene on the surface, held beneath it layers of unspoken debts, old resentments, and secrets carefully guarded over the years. Alistair Carmichael's death was not an isolated act, but the culmination of a history that had quietly unfolded, and whose consequences were now being claimed. The shadows of the past had reached forward, manipulating events and people, and Hamish, patient and perceptive, knew that only by untangling these hidden connections could the true culprit finally be revealed. The wind whispered along the loch's edge, carrying with it the sense of something waiting, of history demanding its reckoning. Hamish rose, resolve hardening. The past had been uncovered, and with it, the path to the truth was emerging. Even if the final moves had yet to be played, Hamish returned to the village the following morning with a quiet determination, his mind already racing through the threads of past and present. He had uncovered connections spanning a decade, and yet the final piece, the one that would identify the true culprit, remained elusive. As he walked past the familiar cottages and the gently lapping waters of the loch, an idea began to form. Sometimes, he thought, the mind of the guilty can be loosened not by direct questioning, but by a carefully placed observation, or an unexpected psychological nudge. He decided to visit the village shop first, under the pretense of picking up everyday supplies. Ailid MacDonald greeted him with her usual measured politeness, carefully avoiding any expression that might betray her thoughts. Hamish moved casually among the shelves, chatting about the weather and the local news, letting his eyes fall on the ledger Alistair had recently purchased that she kept behind the counter. "Curious, isn't it?" he said, voice light. "How some records can carry more weight than we imagine. One misplaced signature, and it can unravel years of quiet lives." Ailid's hands paused mid-motion, and Hamish noticed a flicker of tension in her eyes, just for a heartbeat. He let it linger, pretending to browse, then added, almost as an afterthought, and sometimes people remember things they thought they'd forgotten when a familiar object is placed before them. Her composure cracked ever so slightly. She straightened, fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. And muttered, I don't know what you mean. The hesitation, the tiny quaver in her voice, was a subtle admission. Hamish smiled inwardly, recognizing the delicate crack in her carefully maintained facade. He had planted a seed of unease, and it had taken root. Next, he made his way to Mrs. Mackenzie's home, walking slowly, letting the crisp morning air carry the scent of seaweed and peat. He greeted her warmly and asked to see her collection of photographs, mentioning casually that sometimes old pictures can help jog memories. As she laid them out, Hamish allowed his gaze to fall on one particular photograph, an old image of Fergus MacLean, the man who had disappeared 10 years ago. He let his tone carry a faint curiosity tinged with concern. It must have been difficult, seeing these faces again after all this time. Memories can be tricky, sometimes they reveal more than we intend. Her hand trembled ever so slightly, and she dropped the edge of the photograph, catching it quickly as if startled. I don't know what you mean, she whispered, echoing Eilid's words. Hamish nodded politely, letting the moment pass, but noting every subtle movement, every flicker of emotion. Guilt, fear, and perhaps the memory of complicity were all hidden beneath the veneer of calm. Hamish realized that he could use the same tactic with Ritchie. Visiting him at the pier under the guise of checking on fishing equipment, Hamish casually mentioned that someone had reported seeing him in TBR bar. Village at an unusual hour the previous evening. He phrased it in a tone of bemused curiosity rather than accusation. Interesting how our minds can play tricks on us, he said lightly. Sometimes what we think we saw and what actually happened are two different things. Ritchie's face hardened for a split second before he forced a smile. He laughed a little too quickly and shifted his weight, glancing away. Hamish caught the subtle hesitation, the slight avoidance of eye contact that spoke louder than any denial. He had seen it before, the guilty reaction, not overt, but perceptible to one who watched for the faintest micro-expressions. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had gathered enough information from these carefully calibrated interactions to start forming a clearer picture. He had not asked anyone a direct question about the crime itself, yet the psychological pressure of suggestion, observation, and subtle reminders of the past had caused the suspects to reveal more than they intended. The cracks in their facades, the tiny deviations from practiced behaviour, and the brief admissions of unease had begun to show who carried the heaviest burden of knowledge, and perhaps the deepest motive. As he returned to the loch, the water glinting in the late afternoon sun, Hamish felt the threads beginning to tighten. The unconventional tactic had worked. Rather than confront the suspects with evidence, he had let their own reactions betray them. Somewhere in the delicate interplay of guilt, and carefully hidden truths, the true culprit's identity was emerging. And Hamish, ever patient and observant, knew that the final revelation was now within reach, waiting for the precise moment when all deception would finally unravel. Hamish returned to the Carmichael residence the following morning, determined to consolidate what he had learned and examine the items that had already revealed so much about the tangled web of motives and secrets. The house, usually quiet at this hour, felt different, charged with a subtle tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He moved through the rooms methodically, revisiting the fox figurine, the folded note atop the pocket watch, and the photograph tucked behind the bookshelf. Each object, he knew, had been placed deliberately, and each was a thread that could lead him to the truth. It was when he reached for the photograph that he noticed the first sign of tampering. The envelope had been removed entirely, leaving only a faint impression on the dust behind the bookshelf where it had once rested. Hamish's brow furrowed. Someone had been in the house since he had last examined it. He checked the other items. The note on the watch remained. But the watch itself was slightly askew, as if it had been lifted and replaced. The fox figurine had been nudged, its paw now resting in a different angle, and the initials, once easily discernible, were partially smudged. He stepped back, eyes scanning the room with Wren. Hued intensity. Whoever had altered these items knew their significance and understood that Hamish was following the subtle clues. This was not random mischief. This was deliberate obstruction, a calculated attempt to bury evidence before the detective could draw the final conclusions. Blair arrived soon after, having been summoned by Hamish's earlier call. "It looks different, sir," he said, his voice hesitant. "Do you think someone's been in here?" Hamish nodded slowly. "Yes, Blair. And they were careful. They moved things just enough to confuse or delay us, but not to destroy everything. Whoever did this is clever and patient. We're dealing with someone who understands how I work." Hamish's mind raced as he considered the implications. If the photograph, the note, and the figurine had been targeted, then there was a concerted effort to keep the past hidden, to prevent the connections between the current crime and the unresolved events surrounding Fergus Maclean from emerging. He thought back to the subtle cracks he had observed in the suspects during his unconventional inquiries. Eilid's fleeting tension, Mrs. Mackenzie's tremor at the sight of Maclean's photograph, Ritchie's over-practiced composure, and realized that one of them had acted quickly, attempting to reshape the narrative before it could be fully revealed. Hamish began to re-examine the room with this in mind, looking for overlooked traces. A faint smudge of mud near the window, inconsistent with footprints outside, suggested the intruder had worn soft-soled shoes to avoid leaving prints. The angle of the fox figurine hinted that it had been picked up and replaced from the opposite side of the room, indicating the person knew exactly what they were handling. Small details, invisible to anyone but a patient observer, betrayed the skill behind the interference. The theft or alteration of the photograph particularly troubled Hamish. It had held the only visual link between Alistair and the long-ago disappearance of Fergus Maclean. Without it, the chain connecting past grievances to the present crime risked being severed. Yet the very act of removing it confirmed the photograph's importance, and by extension, the depth of the conspiracy. Someone was desperate to control the narrative, to ensure that Hamish's careful observations would lead to a dead end. He realized, too, that trust had become fragile, not only between villagers and authorities, but within his own circle. Any piece of evidence could vanish or be manipulated, leaving only suspicion and conjecture. The ease with which the intruder had moved through the Carmichael house demonstrated that vigilance alone would not suffice. Hamish would need foresight, cunning, and careful strategy to anticipate the next move. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the dishevelled room, Hamish felt a renewed urgency. The case was accelerating, and the adversary, whoever they were, was now aware that they were being watched. The vanishing evidence was more than an obstacle. It was a declaration of intent, a signal that the game had entered its most dangerous phase. Hamish could sense the tension tightening, like a bowstring ready to release, and he understood that any misstep could allow the true culprit to vanish into the shadows once more. Standing amidst the subtle chaos of the disturbed room, Hamish allowed himself a quiet, steadying breath. The photograph was gone, the note and figurine altered, but the story embedded in these objects remained. Every smudge, every misalignment, every carefully erased mark was a message, and Hamish, patient as ever, knew he could read it. The stakes had risen, the line between truth and deception had blurred, and the village of Lochdu, serene on the surface, held its breath as the final moves of the mystery began to fall into place. Hamish barely had time to collect his thoughts before the quiet of Lochdu was shattered once again. A hurried knock at his office door brought Blair, breathless and wide-eyed. "Hamish, it's happened again." Hamish followed him swiftly through the narrow streets, senses on high alert. The scene was at the old pier, where the fog clung to the water like a pale sheet. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring anxiously as the constable waved them back. At the far end of the pier lay the body of Angus Ritchie. The man had been found sprawled near the edge, one hand clutching the frayed rope of a moored boat, the other smeared with mud and algae as if he had struggled violently. His face bore a look of horror frozen mid-expression, and the deep gash across his temple suggested a blow delivered with both precision and strength. Hamish's mind raced. Ritchie had been the suspect the authorities had eagerly pinned the previous day, and his arrest seemed imminent. Yet here he lay dead, or at least incapacitated, before any formal accusation had been made. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. Whoever had orchestrated Alistair Carmichael's death had anticipated the authorities' rush to judgment and had moved decisively to protect their own anonymity. The villain was still several steps ahead, and Hamish realized the stakes had just escalated dramatically. He crouched near Richie's body, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. The mud around the pier suggested a brief struggle, but the footprints were inconsistent, some leading toward the water, others toward the edge of the pier, then disappearing altogether. Whoever had attacked Richie knew the terrain intimately, and the lack of witnesses indicated premeditation. Hamish noted the same meticulous attention to detail he had observed in the Carmichael home, every move orchestrated to mislead, every trace calculated to leave the viewer uncertain. Blair, shaking, whispered, "Do you think it's connected, Hamish? The watch, the notes, the first crime?" Hamish's gaze hardened. "It has to be. Someone is protecting themselves and they are willing to kill to do it. This is no longer about Alistair alone. It's about controlling the narrative and ensuring the past remains buried." As he surveyed the scene, Hamish's eyes fell on a small detail that others might have overlooked. A single scrap of paper caught in the rope, smudged but still legible. It bore one word, scrawled hastily: "Stop." The crude warning was uncharacteristic compared to the meticulous staging of the previous crime, yet its presence carried the same intent, a message, both for Hamish and perhaps for anyone else who dared dig too deep. He scanned the crowd, noting the faces, the flickers of unease, the subtle signs of hidden knowledge. Mrs. Mackenzie had arrived, drawn by curiosity, and stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands wringing a scarf. Her eyes darted repeatedly toward the water, and Hamish caught the faintest shift in her posture. A moment of recognition, or perhaps fear. Eyelid MacDonald, too, lingered near the market carts, her gaze fixed on the scene with an intensity that suggested she knew more than she admitted. Every subtle motion was a clue, every hesitation a possible lead. Hamish took a slow, steadying breath, realizing that the investigation could no longer proceed on the same careful, methodical path. The perpetrator had made the rules clear. Any further misstep could result in another death. The criminal's knowledge of both the village and the investigator's habits gave them a dangerous advantage, and Hamish knew he would need to anticipate every move, think several steps ahead, and draw the hidden hand from the shadows before more lives were lost. The pier was quiet now, save for the soft lap of water against the wooden posts and the occasional cry of a gull. The urgency pressed on Hamish's mind. The past had not only shaped the present crime, it had now claimed another victim to maintain its secrecy. He glanced at the smudged stop and felt a grim determination settle in. The game had changed, the stakes had risen, and the final confrontation was fast approaching. The criminal was patient, clever, and ruthless. But so, Hamish reminded himself, was he. And he would not be outmanoeuvred, no matter how deeply the shadows of the past reached or how carefully the next move was concealed. Hamish spent the evening poring over his notes, the events of the past days laid out in meticulous order. The death of Alistair Carmichael, the staged evidence pointing to Richie, the subtle cracks in the villagers' stories, and now Richie's sudden and violent demise. Each incident was a separate chord in a symphony of deception, and Hamish was determined to find the underlying rhythm. He spread photographs, sketches, and snippets of interviews across the small table in his office, letting his mind wander over the patterns hidden among them. He returned, almost instinctively, to the fox figurine from the Carmichael home. Its small size had almost made it seem insignificant at first, a decorative curiosity. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, the slight smudge of blood on its paw, the engraved initials, and the deliberate repositioning during the intruder's visit, suddenly seemed part of a larger design. Hamish leaned forward, considering the movements of each suspect in the hours preceding Alistair's death and the moments before Richie's attack, and then it struck him. The pattern was in the small overlooked objects, the ones that seemed trivial, the details that everyone else dismissed. The fox, the note, the watch, even the photograph, all had been placed or manipulated to communicate something only someone paying close attention could interpret. Each item had been a signal, a breadcrumb, a message encoded in placement and timing. The seemingly random clues were anything but random. They followed the habits, obsessions, and routines of the culprit. Hamish's mind returned to Mrs. Mackenzie and Ailid MacDonald, each of whom had reacted subtly but tellingly to his inquiries. Their tiny gestures, the tremor of a hand, the fleeting glance, now seemed to fit into a pattern of feber, and anticipation, almost choreographed to divert attention from the true orchestrator. The stop note left for Richie was the latest expression of this careful control, an explicit warning, yet also a misdirection, meant to suggest urgency while masking intention. He flipped through the old logbook detailing Fergus MacLean's disappearance and compared the handwriting. In the notes, journal entries and messages, a peculiar habit emerged, the same almost imperceptible slant of the letters, the occasional dot placed unusually high on an I, and the faint curl at the ends of certain strokes. The same handwriting quirks appeared in multiple places, on Alistair's last journal entry, on the note beside the pocket watch, and faintly in the old MacLean messages. It was subtle enough that anyone except a careful observer might overlook it, yet consistent enough to form a fingerprint of character. Oh. Mish thought back to the interactions he had orchestrated, the casual remarks, the placement of the photograph, the indirect psychological cues. Each time a suspect had reacted, the response seemed insignificant, until viewed through the lens of this emerging pattern. What had seemed like hesitation, fear, or overconfidence was actually the manifestation of a long-established behavioral code, repeated by the individual who had carried grudges and secrets for years. The pattern was human, precise and patient. S gaze drifted to the fireplace mantel, the fox figurine's new angle, and the partially obscured letters on the photograph. The placement of each item, now viewed alongside timing, prior history, and subtle behavioral quirks, formed a sequence, a communication designed to test observation, gauge reactions, and manipulate attention. The culprit had been playing a long game, using Alistair's acquisitions and the village's routine as instruments, orchestrating events to remain unseen while others misstepped. Hamish smiled quietly to himself. The key had indeed been in plain sight all along, not in a single explosive piece of evidence, but in the careful orchestration of minor details, habitual gestures, tiny marks, offhand remarks, and objects positioned with intent. Everything was connected, and the chaos that had seemed random was now revealed as meticulous design. The challenge was no longer simply to identify the criminal, it was to anticipate the next move before another life was claimed, using the very pattern the perpetrator relied upon to stay hidden. As night settled over Loch Dhu, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Hamish rose and collected the figurine and remaining notes, arranging them once more. He traced each clue in his mind, replaying events, observing reactions, and measuring subtleties. The rhythm was clear now, steady beneath the apparent disorder, and he felt a surge of certainty. The perpetrator's pattern would reveal them fully. The puzzle had been in plain sight all along, but only careful observation and patience could bring it into focus. And Hamish, with his unwavering attention to detail, was ready to follow it to its inevitable conclusion. Hamish spent the next morning retracing the subtle connections he had begun to see, moving deliberately through Loch Dhu, as if following invisible threads only he could detect. The village seemed tranquil under the pale winter light, but he knew the calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface lay a web of fear, guilt, and unspoken histories that had guided every movement of the perpetrator. Each step he took, each glance at a familiar door or window, was measured against the emergent pattern he had identified, the rhythm of the criminal's meticulous orchestration. It was the fox figurine that finally crystallized his understanding. He examined it once more, turning it in his hands as he had countless times before. The engraved initials, the smudge of dried blood, the subtle angle at which it had been replaced after the intruder's visit, all pointed to a personal signature. Not just a tool to mislead, not just a means of hiding the truth, but a reflection of someone who needed control, who had carefully imposed order on chaos for reasons beyond mere gain or spite. Hamish's mind replayed the timeline, the stolen or altered photograph, Ritchie's staged culpability, Mrs. Mackenzie's nervous glances, Ailid's careful avoidance. All were part of a script written long before Alistair's final hours. And then it became clear. This was not about greed or simple revenge, or even old grudges resurfacing after a decade. It was about ownership, control over narrative, over history, over perception. Alistair had unknowingly come into possession of evidence that threatened to expose the carefully managed secrets of a lifetime. The letters and ledgers from Fergus MacLean's estate, the obscure transactions and debts, the unspoken alliances of decades past. These were not merely financial records. They were a ledger of reputation, of social influence, of hidden leverage, and someone in Lochdu had built their entire existence on manipulating that ledger, maintaining their position through subtle threats, secrecy, and fear. Bah! Hamish felt the pieces click together. The villain's psychology revealed itself in every calculated action, the staging of the crime scene, the manipulation of witnesses, the carefully planted and removed objects. Each act was a demonstration of power, a message that they could control outcomes without exposure. The two deaths, the deliberate orchestration of Alistair's demise and Ritchie's sudden silencing, were not merely preventive measures, they were assertions of dominance, designed to maintain the invisible hierarchy that had governed the village for years. Thought again of Mrs. Mackenzie, her fear palpable when confronted with reminders of the past, and Ailid, her meticulous accounting of interactions a shield against inadvertent disclosure, and then Ritchie, who had been manoeuvred like a pawn, caught up in a game whose rules were dictated decades ago. The villain had manipulated the weaknesses and loyalties of others to insulate themselves, using patience and psychological insight to ensure no one could approach the truth until the very moment they chose to reveal it, or until the consequences became unavoidable. Hamish realized that this motive, control over perception and history, explained the extremes to which the criminal had gone. It was not about immediate gain, but about the preservation of a carefully curated world, a personal order maintained across years, impervious to external challenge. The crime had been as much a performance as a killing. Every object placed, every reaction observed, every minor disruption orchestrated to test, measure, and ultimately control the responses of those around them. Standing by the loch as the sun dipped low, Hamish allowed himself a moment to absorb the magnitude of what he had uncovered. The villain had been patient, methodical, and deeply cunning, driven by a psychological imperative far beyond the reach of ordinary motives. The deaths, the manipulations, the staged evidence, all were instruments in an elaborate symphony composed over decades, now reaching its climax. Hamish understood that uncovering the truth would not merely bring justice for Alistair and Ritchie, it would reveal a hidden architecture of the village itself, exposing how one person's need for control had silently shaped the lives of many. The crime had been planned and executed. Why? With precision, but psychology, he knew, always left a trace. And now, armed with the pattern, the subtle clues, and an understanding of the hidden motive, Hamish felt the first clear sense of direction toward the person who had orchestrated everything, someone whose desire to control the past and the present had driven them to murder, deception, and manipulation, leaving the detective to untangle a web that was as much about the human psyche as it was about the evidence itself. Hamish knew that patience had brought him this far, and that patience would be the key to bringing the perpetrator into the open. The village of Lochdu seemed deceptively calm that evening, the fog curling over the loch and the streetlights, casting long, distorted shadows along the narrow lanes. Every detail, the flicker of candlelight in windows, the quiet shuffle of a passing figure, even the wind rustling through the trees, was noted by Hamish as he made his way toward the Carmichael house, where he suspected the final act of the drama would unfold. He had arranged a subtle trap, one that relied not on overt accusation but on observation and the psychology of his suspect. Knowing the culprit's compulsion for control, Hamish had placed a carefully selected object, a replica of the fox figurine, subtly altered, on display in a spot where only the guilty would notice and react. It was an innocuous decoy to the casual eye, but for the orchestrator, it was irresistible, an opportunity to assert dominance, to manipulate, to adjust the scene according to their own design. Hamish, hidden nearby in the shadows, waited for the telltale sign. It did not take long. A slender figure approached the display, moving cautiously, eyes flicking around to ensure no one observed. The hands that reached for the figurine trembled slightly, betraying a mixture of anticipation and fear. Hamish recognized the movements immediately, the same meticulous care, the same attention to detail, the same obsession with control that had governed every stage of the previous crimes. The person was fully invested in maintaining their narrative, yet the very act of touching the figurine exposed their guilt. "Careful there," Hamish said quietly, stepping from the shadows with a calm, measured tone. The figure froze, spinning to face him, eyes wide with shock, and then narrowing with recognition. It was Ailid MacDonald, her posture tight, every muscle taut with the strain of concealment. "Hamish, she began, but her voice faltered, the carefully constructed composure slipping. Hamish took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've been patient, clever, and thorough. I give you credit for that. But you underestimated one thing. People who observe closely eventually see the pattern, even in the smallest details. The fox, the note, the photograph, Ritchie. It all traces back to you." Ailid's breath came fast, and she glanced toward the window, calculating the possibility of escape. "You don't understand Spar," he said, voice trembling but controlled. "It wasn't meant to hurt anyone. I couldn't let the past be revealed. They would have ruined everything." Her hands moved slightly toward the figurine again, a last reflexive attempt to regain control over the objects she had used as instruments of her influence. Hamish held up a hand, calm and deliberate. "You see, the very thing that compelled you to act, your need to control the narrative, to protect the secrets of the past, is what exposed you. Every move you made left a trace, and it all led here." He watched as her shoulders sagged, the tension of weeks and years collapsing into a sudden, involuntary admission. "You think you can maintain order with threats, misdirection, and violence," Hamish continued. "But the pattern is too large to hide, and people notice, even when you think they don't. You couldn't manipulate every detail, every subtle response. That's why I knew the moment would come when you acted on instinct." Ailid's face paled, a mixture of fear and the dawning realization of inevitability. She took a tentative step back, and Hamish noted the slight tremor in her hand, the hesitation that came from knowing there was no further escape. I didn't mean to kill them," she whispered, the first crack in her defiance. "Alistair, Ritchie, I only wanted to protect what was mine. The letters, the ledger, they were mine to guard." Hamish nodded gently, letting the confession flow, the weight of truth finally surfacing. "And that is why you manipulated the evidence, why you staged everything so carefully. But even the most careful plan has weak points, and those weak points are where the truth always slips through." He stepped closer, ensuring she could see the certainty in his eyes. "It's over, Ailid. No more lives need to be lost. The pattern is revealed, and the past no longer dictates the present." For a long moment, Ailid stood silently, the realization settling into her posture, her eyes cast downward. Then, as the first tendrils of surrender touched her resolve, she finally lowered her hands and nodded, the final act of control relinquished. Hamish breathed in the cold night air, feeling the weight of the mystery finally begin to lift. The threads of deception, manipulation, and hidden motives had been untangled, and the true culprit, motivated by obsession and fear, had been brought into the light. The village of Lochdu, quiet once more, seemed to exhale with him, the long shadow of the past receding at last, even as Hamish led Ailid to the waiting constables, feeling the tension in Lochdu slowly ease. A niggling sense of incompleteness tugged at the back of his mind. The confession had neatly tied together the recent deaths, the manipulated evidence, and the decades-old obsession with the Mac-Lean ledger. Yet something subtle, an irregularity he had noticed but dismissed during the final confrontation, refused to fade. The fox figurine's engraving, the placement of the notes, Eva Bar, the minor discrepancies in Ailid's timeline, all seemed accounted for, yet a faint unease whispered that he had overlooked one critical element. That night, as the village settled under a thick fog, Hamish returned alone to the Carmichael home. He inspected the room with meticulous care, retracing the sequence of events from the original crime to Ritchie's death and the staged evidence. His eyes fell on the fireplace mantel once more, where the figurine had been displayed. A subtle scratch along the wood caught his attention, one that didn't match the handling Ailid had described during her confession. He knelt, examining it closer, and realized it suggested that someone else had moved the figurine before her final manipulation. A fleeting impression of a hand, different from hers, lingered in the dust. The thought prickled at him. Could Ailid have been a pawn in someone else's design? His mind retraced the suspects, the villagers whose subtle behaviours had drawn his attention during his earlier investigations. Mrs. Mackenzie, with her nervous glances and hidden knowledge, Blair, eager to declare the case solved at every step, even Ritchie, whose own machinations had ended in death. Could one of them have exploited Ailid's obsession with control to further their own agenda? Hamish's pulse quickened with the realization that the pattern, although mostly unveiled, might have had a hidden layer, invisible until now. He returned to the village square, lingering near the market. As moonlight reflected off the frost, a passer-by, a delivery boy, paused and handed him a folded envelope that had been left at the post office earlier that evening, addressed simply "For the eyes of Hamish Macbeth." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message in familiar handwriting. Look closer at what was assumed to be revealed. Some truths are layered, some masks remain. The ink was unmistakably Mrs. Mackenzie's, the slanted flourish in the letters matching the subtle quirks Hamish had catalogued months ago. Hamish felt the chill of comprehension. While Ailid had acted out of obsession, fear, and a compulsion to control, someone else had anticipated the unravelling of her plan and had ensured she could take the blame without fully exposing their own involvement. Mrs. Mackenzie's subtle manipulations, her careful planting of knowledge and timed reactions, had guided Hamish's investigation along predictable lines, allowing the real architect to remain invisible. The murders and tampered evidence were not just a product of Ailid's compulsions. They had been exploited by someone who understood both human psychology and the detective's methods. Hamish immediately pieced together the implications. The altered photograph, the missing letters, even the placement of the watch and fox figurine, all had been subtly influenced to create a facade that Ailid could manage, masking the deeper orchestration at play. Mrs. Mackenzie's long-standing familiarity with the village, her PR, proximity to both Alistair and Fergus Mac-Lean, and her capacity for subtle influence made her the true mastermind, the unseen conductor of the entire sequence. She had allowed Ailid to take centre stage, confident that Hamish would unravel the patterns but misattribute the ultimate control. He returned to the Carmichael residence once more, pacing silently as the moonlight streamed through the windows. Every detail, every misalignment, every hesitation, every tremor of hand or voice now fell into a sharper focus. Ailid had been reactive, Mrs. Mackenzie had been strategic. The intricate web of fear, obsession, and control that Hamish had traced was only the outer layer. The deeper motive, preservation of reputation, manipulation of legacy, and concealment of past transgressions, had been carefully orchestrated from behind the veil. Hamish felt the thrill of clarity tempered with the weight of urgency. The confession of Ailid, while true, had been incomplete, a partial victory masking a far more deliberate plot. The real confrontation had yet to come, and this last-minute revelation meant that the game was far from over. Mrs. Mackenzie had underestimated his patience and observation, but not his ability to trace the subtle signals, the hidden hands behind the visible actions. The village, still bathed in frost and fog, held its breath as Hamish prepared for the final unmasking, the true genius of deception poised to meet the relentless scrutiny of the detective who had seen the Pabre Bar. Turn in plain sight. Hamish approached Mrs. Mackenzie's cottage under the cover of the dense pre-dawn mist, his mind meticulously replaying every subtle detail that had led him here. The village remained quiet, as if aware that the final act of a long-brewing drama was about to unfold. He paused outside the door, noting the faint smell of peat smoke, the soft creak of a shutter in the wind, and the careful positioning of objects on the windowsill, tiny signs, easily overlooked, that spoke volumes about the person within. He knocked once deliberately, letting the sound linger in the foggy air. There was movement inside, shuffling and then silence. The door opened slightly, revealing Mrs. Mackenzie's cautious, measured gaze. "Hamish," she said, her tone deceptively calm. I thought this would be over." Hamish stepped inside without hesitation, observing the minutiae, the slightly skewed table, the careful alignment of books on the shelves, the faint impression in the dust where an object had been recently moved. Each of these had been a part of her calculated orchestration, guiding events from the shadows while Aelid had acted as the visible agent. "It's not over," Hamish said quietly, "because the truth has layers, Mrs. Mackenzie. Aelid was reactive, she acted from obsession and fear. But you were strategic. Every move she made, every manipulation she attempted, you allowed and shaped to cover your own involvement." Her eyes flickered, a brief crack in her otherwise practiced demeanour. "You think I orchestrated it?" she asked, voice low but edged with challenge. "You have no proof." Hamish allowed a moment of silence to stretch, then gestured toward the fox figurine and the watch still carefully displayed on the mantel. "Notice the placement," he said, his tone even, measured. The figurine was moved before Aelid ever touched it, just enough to provoke her. The watch was slightly adjusted, forcing the note into a position that would draw attention. These small manipulations, unnoticed by anyone else, reveal a pattern, one mind anticipating another, a guide through the chaos. And then there were the letters you left at the post office, the subtle cues to see if I had discovered the underlying connections. You were always several moves ahead. Her hands trembled, whether from fear or the weight of recognition. Hamish could not immediately tell. I only wanted to protect the village," she whispered, "to prevent old secrets from destroying more lives. And you almost succeeded," Hamish said gently, "if it weren't for the subtle traces that always reveal a hidden hand. The scratches in the wood, the impressions in the dust, the irregularities in Aelid's story, they all pointed to someone who had been manipulating events, not reacting to them. You counted on patience and fear to shield yourself, but psychology always leaves a trail. Patterns, even in human behaviour, are rarely perfect. For a long moment she said nothing, the cottage silent except for the faint whistle of the wind through the chimney. Then, in a sudden, almost imperceptible motion, she stepped back and slipped through a hidden side door Hamish had not noticed. By the time he moved toward the space, it was empty. Only the soft echo of movement and a faint trace of peat smoke lingered. Hamish let out a slow breath, the tension ebbing slightly. Mrs. Mackenzie had vanished, leaving the intricate web she had woven partially unravelled but incomplete. Justice, in the conventional sense, would not be served today. Yet the truth was revealed, and the hidden patterns exposed for anyone with patience and observation to see. Returning to the Carmichael house, Hamish reconstructed the events for Blair and the local constables, pointing out the minute clues that had been overlooked, the altered objects, the micro-expressions of witnesses, the strategic manipulations that had guided Aelid's actions and obscured Mrs. Mackenzie's orchestration. "Notice," he said, "how what seemed insignificant, the placement of a figurine, a slight smudge, an offhand remark, was actually the key to understanding the entire sequence. Most would dismiss these as coincidence, but a pattern emerges for those who look closely. It's always there, if you know how to read it." As the morning sun touched the loch, casting silver across the water, Hamish stood quietly, aware that the village had narrowly avoided further tragedy. Mrs. Kenzie's escape left an unsettling sense of unfinished business, a reminder that not all threads could be tied neatly. Yet the intricate truth of what had transpired, the motives, the manipulations, and the pattern itself, had been illuminated. Hamish Macbeth, patient, observant, and relentless, had once again proven that the hidden workings of human nature, when examined carefully, could never remain entirely concealed. And somewhere beyond the village, in the misty expanse where shadows merged with dawn, the true mastermind moved unseen, carrying both the knowledge of their deeds and the certainty that the game was not yet over. Hamish walked along the narrow lane that hugged the edge of the loch, the morning fog retreating slowly under the pale light of dawn. The village had returned to its usual rhythm. Carts creaked along cobbled streets, the gulls cried overhead, and the faint smoke from chimneys swirled into the sky. Yet beneath this ordinary calm, Hamish felt a tension that refused to dissipate. The case of Alistair Carmichael and Ritchie had been ostensibly resolved. Eyelid had confessed, Mrs. Mackenzie had vanished, and the immediate danger to the village had passed. But Hamish, as always, could sense the faint echo of something unresolved, a subtle trace that lingered at the edges of clarity. He paused near the pier, staring out across the still waters. A thin curl of mist hovered over the surface, distorting the reflections of the wooden posts and the distant hills. It was here, among these quiet, shifting shadows, that he often found the space to untangle his thoughts. His mind revisited the sequence of events, the carefully placed objects, the psychological cues, and the patterns he had discerned. Every manipulation, every subtle clue, had fit together into a larger picture. But something still felt slightly off. As he traced the outline of the village with his gaze, his eyes settled on a small scrap of paper caught on the edge of a stone wall. Curious, he stepped closer and picked it up. It was blank, save for a faint, almost imperceptible smudge in the corner, barely visible unless one looked very closely. Hamish turned it in his hand, sensing the deliberate ambiguity. It was the kind of detail a careful mind would leave behind, not enough to be discovered by accident, yet visible to someone patient and observant. The smudge could be a fingerprint, a mark of ink, or a cryptic message meant to tease and provoke thought. Its meaning was unclear, but Hamish knew instinctively that it was placed intentionally. A breeze carried the distant sound of a horse-drawn cart, and Hamish let the scrap of paper slip into his coat pocket, a reminder that even when a case seemed solved, the story was never truly finished. The patterns he had discerned, the motives revealed, and the confessions obtained all spoke of human nature's complexity, and he knew that deception rarely vanished completely. There was always a next layer, a hidden thread, a minor detail left to fester into something larger if left unchecked. He continued down the lane, his footsteps quiet on the frost-hardened earth. The villagers went about their routines, none aware of the precise orchestration that had governed recent events, nor of the subtle, unresolved traces that Hamish now carried in his mind. He smiled faintly to himself. The satisfaction of having uncovered the majority of the truth was tempered by the understanding that human cunning and obsession could never be entirely predicted or contained. There would always be another puzzle, another deception, another shadow to follow. Passing the edge of the Carmichael garden, Hamish noticed the faint indentation of footprints leading toward the old woods. Footprints too fresh to have been left by any of the villagers he had seen that morning. He crouched, examining them with a practiced eye. The pattern suggested someone moving deliberately, carefully avoiding detection, perhaps even observing him as he walked. The thought made him grin, a sense of anticipation tinged with unease. The game was not yet over. Reaching the edge of the village, Hamish paused, taking in the familiar contours of Loch Dhu bathed in early light. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the distant hills, the glimmering loch, and the quiet cottages scattered along the shore. All appeared peaceful, ordinary, and yet he knew better. The truth, as he had learned countless times, was often hidden beneath this veneer of normalcy. And somewhere, just beyond perception, another mystery was quietly taking shape, waiting for the patient observer to notice the subtle traces left behind. Hamish adjusted his coat and continued walking toward the rising sun, each step deliberate, each observation meticulous. The village was safe, for now, but the sense of unfinished business lingered like a shadow at the edge of awareness. A mystery never truly ended, it merely paused, leaving behind the faintest whispers of intrigue, clues for those who were willing to follow, and Hamish, patient, vigilant and ever observant, would be ready when the next thread revealed itself, ready to trace the pattern and uncover the truth that others might never see. As he disappeared down the winding path, the loch mirrored the rising sun, glimmering like a promise. Somewhere in the folds of the village, and the secret still hidden in plain sight, the next mystery waited. Hamish Macbeth, with eyes attuned to even the faintest of details, would be there to unravel it